Hi, it's Mo. It's terrible lighting right now. It won't last long. It is December 17th, and it's time for me to start my December TBR Spin book. The prompt for December was a book that would sober you up after a night of New Year's Eve shenanigans. So perfect for this time of year. Fun prompt in general. And if you don't know what the TBR Spin is, it is a super fun booktube game that was created by Sarah at Freshly Read Books and Jill at the Book Bully. At the beginning of the year, we picked 12 books. Every month, one or the other spins a wheel with prompts on it. The prompts come off once they've been used, so you always get a different set of prompts, and you follow those prompts to choose a book off your stack. More often than not, there's not a book on your stack that fits that prompt, so you have to choose a different book off your stack, switch it out, etc., etc. We've done 12 months of this, but you can start anytime. You can do it starting now and do all 12 in 1 month. You can start in January and go back to the beginning, or you can wait till the end of this video where I will watch the prompt for January 2024, because yes, they're bringing back the TBR Spin, and we will pick our first book for the TBR Spin 2024 at the end of this video. I vlog all my books that I read for the TBR Spin, and I pick the next book at the end of each video. Last month, I already told you the prompt, and the book that I picked was Come Hell or High Water, Hurricane Katrina and the Color of Disaster, which is a nonfiction by Michael Eric Dyson. Now, yesterday I went to start this, and I read literally the first paragraph of the first chapter, and I don't think I can do it. Yes, this book would definitely sober me up after a night of New Year's Eve shenanigans, but it's just too heavy. It's too much about death. The first paragraph is about seeing people dead, bodies floating. It's extremely graphic, and this book could have gone multiple ways. There's no way to get around the horror that was Katrina, but I didn't expect it to be quite so graphic so early on. So I have to pick another book. I can't read this one right now. It's not the right time for me. I will, of course, keep this on my TBR, but for now, we're gonna try and figure out this huge pile of books behind me. I had to move everything around for a house guest that we had, and now I have to move everything back around. So let's do that together, and in the process, let's find another book. Ideally, I would still like to read a nonfiction because I've had such good luck with nonfiction in the TBR Spin. Let me know what you're reading for the TBR Spin in December, and let's find a new book. Okay, it is it's January 1st, and I started reading my December book that I finally decided on for my December TBR Spin. So as you may recall, originally I was going to read Come Hell or High Water, but because it was so violent right at the beginning, I felt unprepared mentally and emotionally to read that. But the prompt for December was a sobering read, so I decided to read Crying in H Mart by Michelle Zauner. So I recently picked this one up in a little free library. Super excited to get to this one because while I wasn't initially going to pick this one up, or I didn't want to read it when I first heard about it when it was super popular a couple of years ago on BookTube, my friend Isaac read this, and so I thought it would be a good one to read too. And the more I've heard about it, the more I have wanted to pick it up, because although it is a memoir of Michelle Zauner and her grief over her mother dying from cancer, it is also a lot about how food played a role in their relationship and how food plays a role in Michelle's life in general. So I have the book, I just have the jacket right now. I'm only about 60 pages into this one, and it starts right off the bat with Michelle crying in H Mart and talking about H Mart, which is a chain of Asian groceries that you can find all over the world, but there are some specifically on the East Coast in the US, and she talks about going there and how it helps her remember her mother and think about her mother's death in a way that allows her to talk about it and to write about about it in this particular memoir. So it kind of jumps around time. She talks about food, she talks about H Mart, she talks about her mother and their relationship, she talks about her early life with her mother as a child, and then she talks also a little bit about her mother's death. And I have a feeling that the entire memoir is going to be like that we're just going to jump around to whatever Michelle is thinking about at the time and how it kind of weaves together all these aspects of Michelle's life and her remembrance of her mother. I am really enjoying it. I've already teared up 60 pages in, so it is a sobering read for sure. I was also able to watch part of the live with Jill from the Book Bully and Sarah from Freshly Read Books. So I got to watch about 45 minutes of that. They did a live show for the first spin of 2024. So I'm super excited that they're continuing the BookTube spin, that they're continuing the TBR spin into 2024. I need to read my December read before I can watch the end of that live and see what the prompt is for January. When I read some more of Crying in H Mart, I will come back to you. I'm back and I have finished Crying in H Mart by Michelle Zauner. This was a really interesting memoir. I definitely teared up. I didn't sob the way a lot of people do reading this book, although there were definitely moments where I shed a tear. I definitely did tear up. I really liked hearing about Michelle's thoughts on music and art and where that comes from and how your parents might be responsible for that in you and how they might not. And it was super interesting to hear about Michelle's relationship with her mother and how much guilt and shame she felt about not living up to her mother's expectations and her mother not necessarily being proud of her, although obviously her mother was extremely proud of her and she cared for her deeply, but just the relationship that they had and the kind of motto that Michelle's mother had about keeping 10% back from anyone and everyone in your life set Michelle up to always feel like she was not enough for her mother. And not enough for her mother, not enough of her mother, not enough like her mother, and then, how she finds out as she grows up that she's more like her than she thought, etc., etc. I find it interesting to read books about mother-daughter relationships and about familial relationships in general because I probably have a very different familial relationship than many people. I obviously can see myself in many familial relationships, my familial relationships in those, but don't feel like the guilt or pressure that a lot of people feel, and you can just feel the pressure that was put on Michelle by her mother, by herself, by her relationship with her father throughout this book and how that affected her whole life. So I find that an interesting thing to read about. I thought that the relationship that Michelle had with her husband or her long-term boyfriend that became her husband throughout this book was really interesting and was very much glossed over in this book. So it would be interesting to read more about that relationship and how her mother's death affected that relationship. I understand that in this book it didn't make sense necessarily to dive too deeply in that. And I also think it would be interesting to hear more thoughts that Michelle has about her father because they have quite a strained relationship throughout this book, and it's interesting to see where they ended up, but you don't really get a conclusion to how their relationship continues after her mother's death. I really liked the hopefulness at the end of this book because it is quite a bleak book. I mean, it is all about Michelle's mother dying of cancer and her deep-rooted pain, feeling of inadequacies throughout her life, especially at the time of her mother's death and during her decline into illness. So this book having kind of a hopeful end and this book kind of leaving it on a positive note, I think was an important choice that Michelle made. I'm super interested to watch some of Michelle's live performances now. They sound amazing. And to listen to her music. I've never listened to Japanese Breakfast before, and I had heard of Japanese Breakfast before hearing about this book, but I didn't really know anything about her music. I still don't. I haven't looked at it yet. I will eventually look at it, but overall, definitely a worthwhile memoir. I think clearly a amateur writer's memoir in a lot of ways, but I think that didn't harm my experience of reading this memoir at all. I think it enhanced it because it feels very conversational. It feels very much like talking to a person that you know, dealing with these stressful things alongside a friend that you can relate to. I do think that there were some choices that maybe the editor could have helped with, just maybe even as far as like an Oxford comma and things like that, because sometimes reading some of the descriptions were confusing. But I did love all the descriptions of food, of course, and I liked how Michelle really used food as a tool for healing as well as a tool to recognize other people in her life. But I also think that would be an interesting thing to read more about, because at one point she talks about therapy not working for her, but then making kimchi being therapy. And I'm like, I mean, sure, but like, you probably need therapy too. So it would be interesting to delve deeper into some of the issues that Michelle is still having based around the grief of her mother and also just her life in general, like going 0 to 60 of being like a famous musician and all of that stuff. It would be interesting to see how her food-related self-care is also managed with other more traditional self-care. Or not even traditional, but, maybe more exterior self-care. I don't know. I think you can heal yourself, obviously, but I also think sometimes it helps to have someone help heal you. It doesn't have to be a Western-style doctor or therapist, but I do think it's an interesting idea to combine those two things and to learn about someone who has combined those two things. So I am super glad that I read this. I do think it was a sobering read, so I think it was the right book for the spin. The other day I did join in with Sarah and Jill's live stream, but I hadn't finished this book yet, so I left the live stream before they did the spin. So today I want to watch the spin with you and see what our first book for 2024 is. Oh, that reminds me. Let me grab my TBR spin list. Okay, fresh Zach. It's so exciting. If you missed my bonus TBR spin vlog where I read Florida, go back and watch that and you will see my thought process on picking all of these books. But really quick, I will just run through them. I have Lot by Brian Washington, which is a collection of short stories. I have The Sleeping Car Porter by Suzette Mayer. I have The Spirit of Science Fiction by Roberto Bolaño. I have Split Tooth by Tanya Tagaq. Sorrowland by Rivers Solomon. Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. The Dead Take the A Train by Cassandra Kaw and Richard Kadri. The Stationery Shop by Marjan Kamali. Build Your House Around My Body by Violet Coopersmith. How to Love a Jamaican by Alexa Arthurs. The Ones We're Meant to Find by Joan He. And The Office of Historical Corrections by Danielle Evan. Now, I think I was spoiled for this spin partly, so let's watch it and see if I'm correct. Okay, so the first spin was swap out an unread book for one you've already read and spin again, which is interesting because to me, the TBR spin is about your TBR. So it's not about rereading a book. It's about just reading a book. But I guess some people consider rereads like on their TBR. I do have quite a few books on my 2023 read shelf that I want to revisit and want to reread. And I really enjoyed in December of 2023 rereading some books from previous years on BookTube. So I think what I might want to do is pick a book that I've read since I've been on BookTube that I want to reread and put that on my spin list. So let's keep watching and see what the actual spin brings, and that will help us determine. Okay, so that is so funny. So Crisis Averted, I don't have to swap out a book at all, actually, because they called that a practice spin. And then the next spin was also to swap out a book, and they called that a practice spin. And finally, our spin landed on a Canadian book. So I think a couple of my books might be from Canada, but there's one that I know for sure. I wanted to check this one. And I guess by Canadian books, they just mean books that are written by a Canadian author. The books, probably they could be set in Canada. Pretty positive. Yeah. So I think the book that I have to go for is The Sleeping Car Porter by Suzette Mayer, because this did win the Giller Prize, which is a Canadian book prize, and I've been wanting to read this. This is by a Canadian author. I'm guessing it's a Canadian story. The only thing that I know about this is that it's queer and that it is about a sleeping car porter. I've heard mixed things about this one, actually, even though it is a prize winner, but it's not that long. I think it's a super exciting book to read for our first book in the TBR Spin in 2024 of 2024. Very exciting. In our next vlog, I will be reading The Sleeping Car Porter. Now we only have 11 books on our TBR Spin list, just like that. Let me know if you're participating in the TBR Spin for 2024. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.